Hello, and welcome to episode 2 of Economy 2.0. My name is Josh Sidman. Economy 2.0 is brought to you by the Silvio Gesell Foundation and the Henry George School. Episodes of this show are recorded live via Zoom and are open to the public. Sign-up links can be found on the websites of both organizations as well as on our social media platforms. Before we bring in today's guest, a few programming notes. Beginning in January, we're going to do 2 episodes a month. Episodes will be on the first and third Tuesdays of each month. Our next episode will be on January 7th at 6:30 p.m. and will feature Patri Friedman. Patri is the founder of Pronimus Capital, a venture capital firm whose purpose is to develop experimental cities in developing countries. Prior to founding Pronimus, he was the founder of the Future Cities Development Corporation and the Seasteading Institute. He's also the grandson of Nobel Prize-winning economist Milton Friedman. And then on January 21st, we'll have an episode starting at 1 p.m. with Stef Kuipers. Stef is a systems engineer from Belgium. He's doing a doctoral thesis in which he's designing a new monetary system incorporating both demurrage and universal basic income. And he's also a board member of an organization called Haponymy. Before we get started, I want to reiterate the mission and purpose of Economy 2.0. This series has 2 different purposes. The first is to explore the idea that the economic status quo cannot and will not continue, and to think about what a post-status quo economy might look like. No one knows what the economy of the future will look like or how we'll get there. Will there be an abrupt collapse? Will it be a gradual transition? But what we do know is that the lives of almost everyone on Earth depend on the continued functioning of our systems of production and exchange. If those systems ever stopped working, it would put the lives of billions of people in jeopardy. So if we believe that the existing system will not continue indefinitely, it's of vital importance that we start thinking about these issues now, rather than waiting until the changes are forced upon us, perhaps in very painful ways. So that's one of the purposes of this series. But every bit as important as that is the second goal, which is to change the way we conduct economic dialogue. As I said last time, most people these days are allergic to economics. They don't understand it, they don't like it, and they don't engage with it. They consider it a subject for the experts. I want to share once again an excerpt from Silvio Gesell that I shared last time. I'll probably share it again and again in future episodes because it's so central to the purpose of this series. Gesell writes, "We must respect our democratic institutions and refrain from introducing laws which are not fully understood by a majority of our people, however useful such institutions might prove to be. It would be a crime against democracy to obtain your acceptance merely by the confidence with which you honor me. Everything must be paid for in this world. The price of democracy is a travail of life's experience. We must see, observe, reflect, and learn. As Democrats, we must refuse to sanction anything we do not understand. As long as you do not act on your own judgment, but follow blindly the judgment of others, so long as you have no confidence in yourselves, but repose full confidence in a ruling class, you are not worthy of democracy. You are the fit prey for aristocrats. You can never establish institutions in advance of your mental horizon. Power over men is seldom, if ever, used for their advancement. The state should reflect the state of mind of the majority. You must learn to examine everything for yourselves and reach the best decisions of which you're capable. That may not give you ideal government, but it will give you the government you deserve. Do not aim at institutions beyond your mental capacity." So every bit as important as the specific ideas and proposed solutions that we're discussing is the goal of having an open and inclusive conversation about economics generally. Because if we agree with Gesell's perspective, finding the best solutions is only half of the battle. The other half is persuading ordinary people, not economists or policymakers, to engage with the subject of economics, to take ownership and responsibility for the decisions we make as a society. And in order for that to happen, a lot of people who up until now have chosen not to engage with the subject of economics need to be convinced to do so. Economics cannot remain the exclusive domain of experts. So I want to say a couple things about how these episodes will be conducted. The goal is to facilitate a conversation, and I'm honestly not quite sure what is the best way to do that. So I'm learning as we go. I got some feedback from our last episode, both positive and negative. My inclination is to allow as much leeway as possible to anyone who chooses to participate in this conversation. So I don't plan to limit or censor what anyone chooses to say. That being said, there may be times when an individual is taking up a lot of time, and in order to ensure that everyone who wants to participate has a chance to do so, I may need to step in and move on to the next participant. To remind everyone, if you'd like to join the conversation, please use the raise hand button, which is under the React tab on the toolbar at the bottom of your Zoom window. Also, just so everyone's aware, the Zoom chat will not appear in the YouTube videos, and I won't be reading the chat. You're, of course, free to use the Zoom chat, but if you have something you want to say, I encourage you to raise your hand and join the conversation. All right. Let me bring in today's guest. Today's guest is Tim Jenkin. Tim is originally from Cape Town, South Africa. His biography is extraordinary, to say the least. Tim grew up in the apartheid era. As a college student in the 1970s, Tim started reading banned literature and began to understand the reality of the system he had grown up under. Through this reading, he became aware of the African National Congress, which was an illegal organization at that time. He joined the ANC and was trained in various covert anti-government activities. Among those activities, Tim designed and detonated multiple leaflet bombs, which scattered anti-apartheid information in public areas. Tim was eventually apprehended and given a 12-year sentence in maximum security prison. The following year, Tim crafted a set of keys out of wood and wire to open a series of 10 locks and escaped from prison. He then fled to London. In the 1980s, Tim created an encrypted communications network that allowed members of the ANC to communicate secretly, including Nelson Mandela, during his period of captivity. The story of Tim's escape from prison was turned into a movie called Escape from Pretoria, and a documentary was made about the communications network called the Vula Connection. Around the year 2000, Tim turned his attention to the economy and co-founded the Community Exchange System, a software platform to enable alternative economic exchange without the use of conventional currencies. Today, the CES is a global network operating in 107 countries. So Tim, welcome to Economy 2.0. Please share with us what the Community Exchange System is and how it came into being.
Thanks for the introduction, Joss. Great. Well, you've cut my speech a bit short. I don't have to talk about myself too much. Anyway, so you've heard a bit about my personal background. I was involved in the liberation struggle, and I lived in exile in the UK from the time that I escaped at the end of 1978 until the unbanning of the ANC in 1990, when Nelson Mandela was released. And in that time, I lived in exile in London and got involved in this underground Operation Vula, which was really, it was the 1980s, long before the internet, and we had to invent our own kind of internet. It's an extraordinary story, even though it's mine. We managed to set up a network of computer communication using telephone answering machines. So activists in South Africa could type up messages, encrypt them, record them on tape recorders, and then transmit them over public telephones to a series of answering machines in London, where they would be decrypted and sometimes forwarded on to the ANC leadership in Lusaka, Zambia. Anyway, I'm not going to go into more detail about that. But when Nelson Mandela was released and the exiles were allowed to return to South Africa, of course, I couldn't get back. I was still a convicted, escaped terrorist prisoner. So I had to wait a year or two for the state president to pardon me. And then I eventually returned to South Africa and continued working for the ANC. So in about 1993, before the first democratic election, I came across this concept of lets. Now I see we have Michael Linton in the audience there, and he's the guy who invented this system. But it came to South Africa in about 1993, and somehow the person who started it managed to get a double-page spread in the Sunday Times, the main Sunday newspaper in South Africa, and it attracted hundreds of people to the first meeting. And I listened to this guy speaking, and I was absolutely stunned that there was such a thing. I couldn't believe it, that people could buy and sell things without money. I'd never heard of this concept. You know, like everyone else, I just thought there was money and nothing else. And if you were going to not use money, well, then you were just bartering things or swapping or exchanging. And it immediately occurred to me that in a country like South Africa, there was still an enormous amount of poverty. We all know about the history of South Africa and apartheid and so on. I just thought this was the most amazing thing. So I joined up this Let's thing, and it was quite active. But this was pre-internet, so early 1990s. So it was all manual. We used paper checks to pay each other, as it were. And then those checks were deposited somewhere, and someone would type them up into a spreadsheet. And there was a monthly statement that was sent to you showing your balance of account. And there was a kind of directory of goods and services that people offered. It wasn't terribly successful because it was mainly middle-class white people offering things that I didn't want, like conflict resolution and so on. I just wanted someone to come and paint my walls and put up shelves for me and fix my car and so on. Anyway, it instilled in me the idea that there's another way of transacting and exchanging things. And I let it go for a while because then was the first election. I was involved in that. And immediately after that, the ANC sent me down to Cape Town to open up their sub-headquarters office, which I ran there. And that in 1995, the internet came alive. And the ANC was one of the very first organizations in South Africa to have a website. I remember on this website, we had a page called Websites in South Africa. In one page, we had all the websites. Most of them were universities and so on. Anyway, so I learned about computer programming right from the start. I had a programming background already because I had developed this encryption system and communication system. And I began to learn how to create databases and how to link them to the internet. And then I met up with an organization called the South African New Economics Foundation, which was based on the British New Economics Foundation, which was looking at alternative economic systems and so on. And we came across Let's once again and decided to create one in Cape Town. And again, it was going to be a pretty manual one because there wasn't anything else really. There was no software that we had that would run this thing. But so it started out just as a regular kind of Let's group with paper directories and paper checks and so on. But I thought, no, this is not really the way to do it because all the work ended up in the hands of the administrator who had to enter all the stuff into the spreadsheet and produce all the documents and all that. And we could see that this thing was not going to take off and that it was just too much work for one or two people. So I started to develop the first online Let's, as it were, for our group in Cape Town. And we launched this in 2002 with the available software at the time, which wasn't great. You know, there were virtually no books you could read on the subject, and there weren't the great tools that you have today in the programming languages and all that. So the tools were very minimal. But we managed to get up a website, and to our own surprise, this thing just took off immediately. And within a few weeks or months, we had 300 members. And as far as we could see, this was the most members that any Let's group had ever had. Maybe Michael will tell us that there were bigger ones, but this thing just suddenly grew. And the difference was that the members could now handle their own accounts, a bit like online banking. You would enter your transactions online and you could advertise your offerings and wants online. And the administrator had virtually nothing to do, just manage the system and take on new members. And it was enormously successful. And within in a few months or 6 months or so, we were up to 1,000 members. And then other groups around South Africa heard about this and asked for us to create the same, which we did in the main centers in Johannesburg and Durban and Port Elizabeth and East London. And so within, I think that first year, we created 10 groups, but all of them were independent. They couldn't trade between them because each one was just a clone of the original. And then somehow it got over to New Zealand, and where Let's was very big in New Zealand and Australia. And they asked if they could be part of it. And so we signed up the entire contingent of Let's groups in New Zealand. And there were many. And then we realized we needed to find a way for these groups to be able to trade amongst themselves because many of them were often very close by or even in the same city. And we managed to figure out a way for groups to communicate with each other, and I will demonstrate that on the site. So it was really just a scene of enormous growth, because the next year, practically all the Australian Let's groups came on board, then many in Europe, and then many all over the world. And over the time, we've created something like almost 3,000 groups. Of course, many of them fail. Many of them just come there just to look and they sign up and never do anything. And many of them don't really understand what it's about. They think simply by creating an instance on the internet, the trading community is going to form on its own. That doesn't happen. You know, what we've provided is really just a set of tools. The community is an on the ground thing. It consists of real people engaging in real trade and conversation and getting together and meeting and having markets and so on. So that's about all I want to really say about the history of it. I think now I will demonstrate the CES website. Now, I need to warn you before we do that, our software is very old. As I said, it started in 2002, and it's still running that basic software, although we've improved it a lot. But it has a very old look about it. It's not a very exciting website because, well, it's a bit like a bank account, you know. No banking software is very exciting. There are no pictures or anything like that. And it's fairly complex, but recently we put together an international team who are now planning to develop CS to another level, and we're in the process of designing and creating proper downloadable and installable apps for mobile devices. So I can't show you that, but we have already an online web app, so to speak, which is designed for mobile telephones. So this is the home page of the Community Exchange System. As you can see, we've got an announcement here about our upgrade. There's a whole lot of blurb here. If you check in, I'm not going to show you that. You can read it for yourself. I'm just going to log in immediately. So this is my personal account. As I said, you can see that the style of it is very old-fashioned, all these drop-down menus and so on. And it looks very intimidating to most people when they first come in here. But this menu across the top here contains the basic functions. Home is where we are right now. These are all the trading functions. So we have single trading, multiple transactions, transactions prepared offline, remote transactions where we can trade with other systems. We have schedulers and conversion rates. I'll show you more about that. And we have all stuff about all the users. In Cape Town, in our group here, we've got about 7,000 members. I wouldn't say they're all active, but they're there. This is all my personal stuff about my own account. Here is where we can see all the offerings, which are adverts. And this little block here, these are the latest offerings that have been added. These are wants. Here are various announcements. This groups function, well, I don't need to go into that today. This is all kinds of information about the system. So I'm not sure where to start, and maybe just show you some latest offerings. Do all kinds of searches in this exchange, in South Africa, all around the world. There's all kinds of information here. I'll just list all the exchange groups in the world. You can see which countries they're from here. Hundreds and hundreds of groups. And if we can even scroll to the bottom, there should be several thousand. Maybe it's easier. I go back to the top and sort by country. What's happening? I think it hasn't even listed. Okay, there it is. There you can see we got Argentina, Austria, Belgium, Bolivia, Botswana, Brazil, Cameroon, Canada, quite a lot in Canada, Chile, Colombia, Costa Rica, millions in Ecuador. This will just go on for ages. Finland, quite a lot in Finland. France, international. Anyway, I don't need a lot in South Africa as well. Spain, many in Spain. Okay, so let's just get out of here. Haven't really explained how the international trading works, but
Tim,
every yes,
before you get into the international trading part, um, could you perhaps describe how the Let's architecture works? I think probably many of the people who are in this meeting today are familiar with it, but this, of course, will go on YouTube, and we
yeah.
can't take it that everyone watching knows what a Let's system is.
Okay, great. So we've got offerings. So say you see something you want, then you will contact the provider, just as you would on any trading platform. You either place an order with them, or you say, I'd like to come and see you for some service, or I'd like to receive whatever goods you're offering. And then the exchange takes place. But of course, there's no money. So say you've seen a bicycle advertised and you want that bicycle, you simply jump on it and ride off. And then the seller, well, let's say I'm the seller, I've just sold a bicycle to someone, and they've received the bicycle, and I would then enter a single transaction. I would enter their account number here. I'm just using this one because it's an account that I know. And I would say bicycle, and let's say it's 500 units, whatever that is, and then confirm. This is just a confirmation page, just as you would have on your internet banking account. But remember, I am the seller who's entering the transaction here. So this, for most people, this is counterintuitive because in the regular economy, it's normally the buyer who pays the seller. But remember, we're not paying anyone. There's no currency. All we're doing is creating a record. So either side could create the record, but since I'm the seller and the buyer is probably going to forget anyway, why not me as the seller enter it? So I enter it, and that's it, done. And it was very quick there, but there's a lot of programming behind that because it records the credit for me and the debit for the other side, and we have a levy system which is currently set to 0 in Cape Town because we actually raise too much. So that levy rate can go up and down. So the levy is really just a transaction fee, which then goes to the administration to manage the system. So it's a bit like, VAT or transaction tax on money. Any transaction that you make, small proportion would go to the government. And that would be their revenue. So you could say this is the way that the exchange raises its revenue through the transaction levy.
I'm going to play the part of someone who is completely unfamiliar with what Let's is. And my question would be 500 what? 500 watts are those?
Well, we call our currency talents. And what is the value for talent? Well, we base it on the national currencies, but there's no exchange rate. It's not transferable into South African rands, not exchangeable for rands. We just use the rand as a reference, simply because people understand it. So if I say a loaf of bread is 30 rands, then it would be 30 talents, and that's meaningful to someone. But if I say it's 5,000 units for a loaf of bread, everybody will say, well, that sounds very expensive. So we just use the national currency. That does mean that as the national currency inflates, so does our currency. We're not, as I said, we're not linked to it. So if tomorrow there was hyperinflation in South Africa, we could just delink and say, okay, we'll just use the 2024 understanding of the rand, and that will be our usage. We do have what's called a base currency. So all the groups, so when it records that transaction, no one sees this, but it's in the database, it converts every amount entered into a base currency, and the base currency is 1 hour. And so at what rate do we convert to 1 hour? We take the national average hourly wage rate for 1 hour. So an hour is a constant. It never changes and can never change. But the hourly rate will obviously change. It's as the national currency inflates, so that number will go up. So currently, the conversion rate from the rand to an hour is 200 units per hour. So in other words, 200 rand per hour, so 200 talents per hour. So that bicycle that I've just entered would be converted into our units, which enables us to have this comparative currency between all these thousands of different community exchanges, and it allows us to trade and to have a conversion rate between all these different groups. That might sound a bit complex. I'll show you some diagrams. But users don't need to know all this stuff. In fact, they don't know about it. I'm just telling you about it. And it's just for us to manage the system. And everything is completely transparent. You don't need to know about any of the mechanics behind it, how it works. Even though we have these hundreds of conversion rates, you don't even need to worry about that. Because normally it's the seller who enters the transaction. So if I go to Australia and I get accommodation there, it's of no interest to me really what cost of it is. I can convert it into my currency just for information purposes. But as the seller will be entering it into their transaction form, the system converts it into my currency. And when I look in my statement of account, it's already converted into my currency. So I don't have to worry about exchange rates. I don't have to carry traveler's checks. I don't have to worry about interest and payments and all sorts of nonsense that involved in normal, conventional international trade. It's absolutely instantaneous and completely transparent and instant. And what I wanted to do was, after demonstrating the website, is to talk about the three concepts involved in the name of CES, Community, Exchange, and System, but starting backwards with system, because that's rather germane for this seminar. I mean, we've called it Economy 2.0, and prior to that, we called it Imagining Post-Capitalism. So clearly, we're talking about economic systems. Now, what is an economic system? I mean, how do we define it? You know, the economics books would define economics or an economic system in terms of resources, production, distribution, consumption. Or economics books often say land, labor, and capital. But what is the actual system? What comprises the system? How do we define it? And in fact, why are we focusing on economic system and not focusing on the whole? Why are we abstracting economy out of the whole, society out of social system? is economy above society, or is it above a social system? Is it more important than the social system, or was economy a subsystem under society or the social system? Where does it fit in? Why do we select economy two instead of society two or social system two? So why is it that we actually focusing on it, and what is wrong with economy one, and what's wrong with capitalism, and what do we imagine the next one is going to be? And in fact, is it possible to change an economic system? Because isn't a system just everyone on Earth, all 8 billion of us, trying to create our means of existence, and at this current time using money? So it's what people do, trying to make an existence using money. And why is it that money is so important above, say, exchange? And when we talk about changing an economic system, do we mean that we have to choose from the named economic systems like, what do they say? We've got capitalism, we've got socialism, we've got a mixed economy, we've got communism. What else is there? These are kind of off-the-shelf economic systems. So which one do we pick, or can we create something else with another name? And why, as I said, why are we choosing to latch onto the economy? Why not something else? And are we saying that the relations of production or the economic relations are prior to anything else? Are social relations secondary to economic relations? I mean, that's the idea that Marxists push, that the economic foundation and the social relations of production determine, the superstructure of society, and everything else is secondary to economic relations. I would, in fact, argue that the mode of production, which is what we're talking about, different economic systems about different modes of production, is secondary to modes of exchange. I would say that exchange, you might think it's crazy because you can only have exchange after you produce them. But you produce something because you can exchange it, or the mode of exchange determines what you produce. So let's go right back to the beginning of history. I mean, you've got societies, hunter-gatherers and nomads, people who are basically not much different from wild animals, just plucking their existence from nature. They're not producing anything. They're just chasing after animals, shooting them, picking berries from trees and fetching roots from the ground and eating them. It's not, you can't really call that production. That's just receiving what there is with bounty of nature. So surely the relations of exchange is far more important than the relations with production in that kind of setting, because how you share the catch, how you share what's being gathered, is how the society is formed, which determines the nature of the society. You might go to the next stage where excuse me, I'm just getting a bit choked up, really. Where humans started to settle, and they became herders and farmers. And again, would you say they were producing anything? Because production usually implies production for something. So either for money or for someone who's demanding something of you. But if you're just producing your own food, is that really production, or are you just providing your means of existence? So early farmers, again, perhaps their relations of exchange are far more important than their relations of production, because they probably didn't really engage in collective production. They were just exchanging surplus with each other. And so we can go on to the next stages. You know, I don't want to run through the entirety of history. You know, there's been many stages. But obviously, at later stages, you've got sort of strong men and chiefs and so on, and then society started to be divided into classes or groups, and then the leaders started demanding that the peasants produce stuff for them, and then they would store it in warehouses, and you got sort of palace economies growing up in Mesopotamia and so on, and they kept records of production. People were required to deliver so many bushels of barley or so many liters of milk or whatever. And these were all recorded. And this was, say, the beginnings of exchange systems where you record things. And we know this because, you know, the archaeologists have found thousands of clay tablets where all these things are recorded. And so they had quite an evolved community, exchange system. But there's no money there as we understand it. There's no object. There's no means of exchange. There's no representation of value, which money is supposed to do. It's a token of value, a representation of value. So there's none of that. But you could say that there is production, but still, the mode of exchange again is far more important than mode of production, because production was carried out by the peasants, and there was no sort of capitalist classes. So we can go on and on and on, but I'm not saying that mode of production is unimportant. I'm just saying that mode of exchange as well as mode of production need to be taken into account. We don't do that because we assume money is just one of the constants of the universe. And it's a constant, so you don't fiddle around with constants, just there. So that's why we don't really ask about exchange.
Tim, can I
yeah.
interrupt briefly? I completely agree that exchange is fundamental. And I think that's something that you and I have in common in terms of our critique of the mainstream economic system, is that we see the problem as being in the domain of exchange, as opposed to, for example, and from the Marxist perspective, the problem is, as I understand it, is in the realm of production.